This is Beyond Species, a podcast exploring issues around speciesism and the struggle to dismantle it. I'm Tofu Steve, and welcome to the episode. In this episode, we hear from Justin. Justin speaks to us about the advocacy work of Triangle Chicken Advocates and the Microsanctuary Resource Center. They explain that sanctuary can be offered at any scale. By bringing non-humans into our homes, we're able to deepen our understanding of them as individuals. This opens up a range of possibilities for activism and education, and leads us towards a deeper engagement with vegan practice. We also hear about some of the challenges of liberation and sanctuary provision. Okay, if you want to start then by telling us about Triangle Chicken Advocates.
Yeah, absolutely. My partner and I got together in 2011 and 2012. They had already been involved doing cat and dog rescue with kind of local rescue organizations. And I, kind of became a willing participant and partner on that. And we were active in, doing cat and dog rescue. And then we moved to the property where we're at now in late 2013. And just in our work doing dog and cat rescue, we had started to notice that there were farmed animals in local shelters. And it was kind of a shock because, it just seemed like so strange for there to be like a goat, at a local shelter. And so when we started looking into it, we started to realize that, and I won't get into details, but the system with farmed animals here in this state, especially, is extremely just messed up. The way that they're handled, the way that they're dealt with, in contrast to typical companion species. And so we became interested in trying to find ways to help the farmed animals we saw, and specifically to try to pull them from shelters or adopt them from shelters and place them at sanctuaries. In kind of our general area. And this was back in, like I said, like late 2013 that we kind of started noticing this. And then things really happened in February 2014 when kind of as, the part of doing that work with farmed animals in the local shelters, we rescued 2 hens. And it was the first chickens that we had rescued. Neither of us had much, if any, experience working with chickens. I had a little bit of experience with them growing up as a kid. One of my relatives had some. And so, we didn't really know what we were getting into, but we planned on doing what we had done before, which was to find a sanctuary to place them at. And so when we got them home, we very quickly fell madly in love with them. They were, we just everything about them just seemed like magical. And so we had talked a little bit about maybe one day, having a small flock of chickens that we had rescued. And so we thought about it and we talked about it and said, well, we have the space. We can do this right now. We're in love. We love these 2, and we can adopt them the same way we would like a dog or a cat. So and we had also been realizing very quickly while doing the placement work that all the sanctuaries were more or less full. There weren't as many back then in early 2014 as there are now, but the same problem persisted, which is that most places weren't taking in new animals. It was very hard to find placement for them. And so the 2 hens, Clementine and Amadine, basically started Triangle Chicken Advocates as a sanctuary. Since then, we've grown a lot. We have many more animals now, and we have a little over 100 chickens, and about roughly half and half roosters and hens. And over the years, we've really become passionate about a number of things. One is really thinking about designing our sanctuary space with kind of the needs of chickens in mind. So not just inheriting like a farming model, which is that chickens, the best life they can have is out in an open pasture. We really researched their ancestry with red jungle fowl, and kind of adopted like a kind of an edible forest garden type approach to building their space in order to coincide with a lot of their instinctual behaviors and needs as descendants of jungle birds. And then we've also really been working hard to promote roosters, and educate about roosters, and to increase the knowledge of rooster flocks as kind of like a phenomenon amongst rescues. And so we have, one of the largest rooster flocks that I know of. Right, it hovers usually around like 30 to 40, depending on what we're doing. But it's a stable flock, and we've been really helping to educate others about the ways to do rooster flocks successfully, and the needs of roosters, because they're hands down the animal most in need when it comes to adoption and rescue and shelters. There are tons of roosters everywhere. So
Why is that there's such a need for roosters
yeah,
to get a
that's a
home?
great question, and it ties into the third thing. But the main reason is because of backyard chicken farming. As I'm sure you probably are aware, backyard eggs are a huge fad
Mm,
everywhere, and especially in the States, more and more cities are allowing backyard chickens
mhm,
for people who want to, they believe, like, get happy eggs.
mhm,
But unfortunately, one of the consequences of that growth is an increase in the number of roosters who are in need of homes, because chickens hatch roughly equal numbers, male and female chicks. And even though hatcheries that provide chicks to most of these backyard farmers, like in industrial hatcheries, they sex the chicks and they,
mm,
kill the boys, roosters inevitably end up in backyard flocks. And when they do, once they crow for the first time at about 4 to 6 months of age, either the person who has the flock doesn't want them because, they don't make
mhm,
eggs, so what's the point? Or most cities and towns actually ban roosters from being in city limits. So even if somebody wanted to keep a rooster, they legally would not be allowed to do so. So the result is that as soon as the roosters crow, out they go. And they're either dumped in the woods, they're sent to a shelter, dumped at a shelter, or they're just killed, by
mm,
the human with the flock. And in a lot of places, unfortunately, like, that backyard slaughter is legal. So
mm,
if someone wants to, they can just kill a rooster in their backyard. And so that the backyard egg phenomenon is really what drives a lot of the huge need for rooster rescue. And most sanctuaries don't want to deal with roosters, so there aren't many, a lot of places that will
mhm,
take them.
mm,
So that's been kind of like something that we've worked really hard on. And honestly, like, I mean, we've rescued hundreds and hundreds of chickens over the years, and almost all of them have come from backyard farming situations. So that's one of the main things that we educate on, is not just like kind of the problem with eggs, but also kind of the problem with specifically backyard farming and the humane myth tied up around like backyard farming.
mm,
And so the harms of eggs is our kind of like our third major educational front, and coupled with kind of increasing the quality of healthcare for chickens,
mhm.
amongst rescuers and sanctuaries.
Okay. And where do you do the outreach, or who are the type of people that would normally take part in it?
Yeah, so we're a little bit different than a lot of sanctuaries, because we're small, and we both have jobs and other things that we do.
Mhm,
We don't do kind of what's typically called humane education, where we have public tours regularly, and visitors like that. We do some of that, but it's very limited.
mhm,
The majority of our education is online, and especially like one of our major focuses for education is actually educating other vegans who rescue chickens or are interested in rescuing chickens. So right after we started TCA, my partner started a Facebook group called Vegans with Chickens. And in the 6 years since then, it's up over 5,000 members. It's a very active group with members around the world. And it's really, pushed some pioneering healthcare for chickens at sanctuaries and with rescuers,
mhm,
in a way that's really raised the expectations for what standard, the high standards of care should be for chickens at sanctuaries and
mhm,
rescues, and coupling that with sharing information that can be really helpful for doing education about the harms of eggs.
mhm,
So a lot of our educational focus is really on raising standards when it comes to what's expected for chicken care and chicken habitat. And so that ends up meaning that a lot of like the outreach and education we do is actually with other vegans who are currently rescuing or interested in rescuing chickens. And
Mm.
then the ripple effect is that, as chickens get a higher standard of care and more is known about kind of what goes on with their biology related to eggs or, flesh production, more and more advocates for chickens are created.
Mm. Okay. What's the concept then of the microsanctuary?
Yeah, so it really grew out of TCA because when we started with just two hens and 3 acres of property, we didn't really see many other models of sanctuary that looked like us. Back then the main ones were like Farm Sanctuary and Woodstock Sanctuary and Gentle Barn, places like that, who have hundreds of acres and hundreds of animals and staff and $1 million budgets and things like that. And it seemed like a completely different level and model than what we were doing with our two with the two hens.
Mm-hmm.
And so my partner coined the term microsanctuary when we were just kind of like thinking about and talking about what we were doing. But it came along with a very serious examination of what sanctuary actually is and what the word sanctuary actually means.
Mm.
And when you say sanctuary, specifically a farm animal sanctuary, the image that pops into one's head is usually of like a large farm. So the only difference is that on these farms, instead of the animals being raised for exploitation, they're given care for them the entirety of their lives, and they're treated with respect rather than as commodities.
Mm-hmm.
So in terms of like the physical model, sanctuary usually implies that kind of a model, like a farm. But at the heart of it, what sanctuary actually means has nothing to do with the size and the scale of the operation. It really hinges upon the respect and care given to the non-humans who reside at the sanctuary.
Mm-hmm.
And so providing sanctuary can happen on any scale. It's really about the mentality that's brought to that caregiving. And so, we really started to rethink how sanctuary, the word and the concept, could potentially function,
Mm-hmm.
and how we could potentially like reshape the concept of what sanctuary was. And micro sanctuary was kind of a way to provide some distinction from like that association between the word sanctuary and large sanctuary organizations, while at the same time emphasizing that like the whole core of what sanctuary is about respect, care, and treating non-humans as individuals and not as commodities. And like I said, that can happen with one chicken as much as 100
Mm-hmm.
chickens. And so that's really where microsanctuary grew out of, was rethinking what sanctuary meant and thinking about the implications for doing it on a much smaller scale than we were typically seeing. Um, and we did have models for kind of what we were doing. Like back then, the main one for us, and really the place that without which TCA wouldn't exist, is Chicken Run Rescue. They're a rescue in Minnesota that has just done amazing work and set a lot of the precedents that we've kind of carried forward. But and just in terms of like living space and quality of care and things like that. So,
Mm-hmm.
but really, by and large, there were very few places who were doing what we were doing on our scale and like in association with the word sanctuary.
Mm-hmm.
And so we used the word micro sanctuary to kind of reach a new community of people and kind of make people aware that sanctuary wasn't something that could only happen once you won the lottery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sanctuary could happen the same way that adopting a dog or a cat could happen,
Mm.
which is using the resources that you have to provide sanctuary and care to
Mm-hmm.
an individual animal.
Yeah.
And that's really kind of where microsanctuary kind of got its start.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a good point you make, because you often see on social media, I mean, that there's a lot of, the bigger sanctuaries, and some of them encounter financial difficulties and then kind of have to do urgent fundraising.
Right.
It's at times like that when you see the kind of things that sanctuaries come up against, whether it's legal issues or just, having to pay for like a new fence or all sorts of
Yeah.
things. And obviously that thing about, unfortunately, there's a lot of non-human animals kind of taken to them that they can't always take in. I guess
Mhm.
there's vet bills and so on. So I think, so when I speak to a lot of people about sanctuaries, you often hear vegans say like, "Oh yeah, I'd love to have a sanctuary one day." I'd love to care for
Right.
animals and things like that. But it obviously must feel like such a big task and such a like it's like would be like, yeah, really nice to do that, but really there's only a few people who are only ever going to be able to afford to do it. So getting this concept of the micro sanctuary out, I think, is really important. And also, there's a lot of people who probably are caring for maybe smaller animals in their home that don't realize that they
Mhm.
are offering sanctuary.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that was one of the most interesting results of starting to speak about micro sanctuaries. A concept was the number of vegans who came forward and said, "Oh my God, I'm a micro sanctuary. I didn't even know
Mm-hmm.
it." And whether it's chickens or rats rescued from a lab, lab experiments, or other animals who are raised and bred primarily for profit,
Mm-hmm.
rather than like companionship. There are vegans who are doing this everywhere, and most of them, are doing it on a very small scale, and they're doing it as part of their activism as
Mm-hmm.
vegans. And so for us, it was really amazing just to see how many people were already doing this, but there wasn't really a community specifically for people doing it on that small scale. So they're, instead of being just like the one weird vegan with some rescued
Mm-hmm.
rats, like they're part of a movement, of people who are doing this as activists, providing caregiving, to exploited
Yeah.
animals. And I do think that there is a lot of intimidation that comes with only having the large sanctuary model as a model for sanctuary, and why you hear so many people saying they would love to have one
Mm-hmm.
day, and so few people actually starting one.
Mm-hmm.
And so just in terms of like growing the community of or growing the number of homes available for
Mm-hmm.
animals, I do think that only having that large scale model really is a hindrance, because like I remember when I started getting interested in sanctuaries back in 2010 or so, and I was like, there's no way I could ever figure out how to buy 100 acres and raise millions of dollars every year. Like that's not
Mm-hmm.
possible. Like I was living alone in a small house, with like a dinky job, and I was just like, that I don't know how I'm going to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's the position a lot of people are in, and you can really tell that because usually it's like their interest in sanctuary comes with a caveat of like one day or when I win the lottery or something like that. And yeah, and what we're trying to say is, well, no, like just as in you don't have to wait to win the lottery to rescue a dog or a cat. If you have the means to do so, you can do it. You can do the same thing just with other species who are typically treated as farm products and trash,
Mm-hmm.
basically, in the case of roosters. And doing so is actually really radical, because not only are you doing activism through direct rescue and giving value to an individual who society sees as valueless, but that act of caregiving is actually really, and we can talk about this more, like really reshaping not only the way you but other people begin to see who these animals are,
Mm-hmm.
and to challenge the speciesist assumptions that we all have when it comes to farmed animals, as a group, as compared to typical companion species like dogs and
Mm-hmm.
cats.
Yeah, what I have noticed in the vegan community that so many people, including myself, probably are guilty of is that unpacking speciesism is like a lifelong process. So you don't just turn
Hmm.
vegan and all of a sudden become the most moral person. And you know, like to me, there's like a difference between being a vegan and an anti-speciesist, or at the minute anyway, within the movement, because there's a huge vegan movement, but there isn't much talk going on
Right.
about like what are we doing to unpack that human privilege within ourselves. It's much more about, oh well, animals are treated cruelly, so if you stop eating them you won't be
Right.
contributing to it. So is that the kind of thing you're talking about when people start caregiving to animals and bringing them into their home, it kind of changes the dynamic, even for vegans who supposedly, care about animals?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have two ways to answer that. The first one, just from a personal perspective, I had been vegan for 15 years, when we rescued Clementine and Amandine, the two
Hmm.
hens. And so, the reason that I went vegan was because I didn't want to contribute to animal
Hmm.
suffering. And, so the entire reason that I went vegan was wrapped up exclusively in concern for animals. It had nothing to do with climate justice. It had nothing to do with health or anything like that. Like I wasn't aware of any of those things when I went vegan. It was specifically for avoiding harm to animals. And so, as a 15-year vegan, when we rescued Clementine and Amandine, my veganism changed overnight when they came into our lives. It added so much more depth and urgency to my veganism because I was able to see so clearly how wrong all the cultural narratives about these animals were,
Mm.
and how important it was to think about understanding them as individuals, not just as
Mm-hmm.
concepts. And so, what I find in because we're so dissociated as a culture from our food, and that's kind of like a direct consequence and goal of a capitalist food system, is separating us from our sources of food so that so much more exploitation can happen
Mm.
and drive the prices down. One of the consequences of that is that we have no idea who these animals are.
Mm.
We talk about them, but we don't really include them in our movement. And so it's very easy to inherit speciesist assumptions about farmed animals specifically, because we don't know any different. We don't have any experience to challenge those. And it's really dangerous when we perpetuate the notion that these individuals are merely
Mm.
victims. And so the way that we represent and present farmed animals, it's very complicated because even if we're advocating on their behalf, if we continually only know them as victims and only know them as like abstract
Mm.
concepts, it really becomes hard to understand why we're doing this in the first place and why it's such a violation to exploit them, whatever the numbers are. I've always said, that like I would be against farming and animal agriculture, even if it was just one animal.
Mm.
Like it doesn't matter that it's one animal or 9 billion animals who are slaughtered, in the US, or and even, trillions, including sea life. What matters is the fact that this exploitation is happening to individuals.
Mhm.
And so if it happens to one individual, it's still wrong. And genocide isn't wrong because it's or murder, excuse me, murder isn't wrong only when it reaches the level of
Mhm.
genocide. It's an act of violation against one individual. And that's really, I think, something that you're able to see when you start doing caregiving, because you get to see who these individuals really are.
Mm.
And so that's why I think that one of the most powerful components of caregiving and running a micro sanctuary for activists is to be able to really understand who these animals are and to make them a part of vegan activism and anti-speciesist
Mm.
activism. And I think it's very, very hard to do that if you have no connection to them and you don't know them. And so, if we merely replicate this narrative that animals are victims, I mean, even if we're advocating to stop the exploitation, it still puts animals in a very complicated position just in terms of representation,
Mm.
and how we understand them. And if we merely understand them as victims, then we don't really understand, one, the fullness of who they are, and two, the depths of depravity that comes with exploiting them as
Mm.
commodities.
Mhm. Yeah, there seems to be a real disconnect between a lot of vegan activism and, like you say, representing or I guess uplifting or amplifying the voices of these
Hmm.
individuals. And it is interesting that you say that it's like that they're almost an abstraction to the movement, because when there's people doing outreach or even like a direct action kind of protest, unless it's going into a farm or something. But if you like tying
Right.
yourself to a gate or something um, for an
Right.
office or whatever, the animals aren't there with us. So
Yeah.
we talk about them a lot, but we don't necessarily spend a lot of time with them. And I guess a lot of people
Hmm.
might say, well, I live in an apartment in the city. I can't have resources to get out to where the animals are to be able to do that. Um,
Right.
but this is where this
Right.
micro sanctuary thing could come in, because actually we all have it. A lot of us have, not all, I'm sure, but a
Right.
lot of us have the ability to bring these animals into our home and give them that proper sanctuary. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's honestly like one of the things that the most exciting future features of microsanctuary, I think, and something that we quickly realized, shortly after starting the microsanctuary movement, was that the real like potential for microsanctuaries is in urban
Mm.
areas. Um, and the growth that we've seen, where urban activists are starting microsanctuaries with, one liberated hen, it's really promising. And I think that, because what we're doing is we're not saying, you have to devote every waking moment and every penny that you have to starting a large sanctuary. It's more like, when you're thinking about rescuing or adopting an animal, please consider farmed animals and other exploited species,
Mhm.
and here are all the reasons why doing so can be a radical
Mm.
act. Like that's, to me, is really amazing, because what we're trying to do with micro sanctuaries is not make a small number of, supposedly special people shoulder the entire burden of the animal liberation
Mm.
effort. It's more about creating a community of people doing it on a sustainable scale. And the more people you have doing that, the more animals who can be liberated and provided lifetime
Mm.
care. So, it's very much like a collective approach, rather than like, having a small number of saints who do all that work.
Yeah.
And really, like, urban areas are such a great place for a potential place to do that, because many major cities especially still have like live markets, and like trucks who come through, and slaughterhouses nearby and things like that. But also it allows for sanctuaries to come to the population, rather than forcing the population to drive hours and hours to get to a large
Mm.
sanctuary. So outreach potential is huge. And one person I'll mention, who is actually one of our new board members for the Microsanctuary Resource Center, Mahika Gupta. They rescued a hen named Corey, who lives in Philadelphia, and at their micro sanctuary. And they have an amazing social media account, Corey Lives, on Instagram. But Corey does activism. Corey does urban activism along with Mahika.
Mhm.
And just hearing the stories that they tell, and the reach that they're able to have, you see just this amazing catalyzing potential of urban micro sanctuaries, because it makes it possible for farmed animals to be present
Mhm.
and to be seen as companions in spaces where typically you only would see dogs or cats.
Obviously, the industry works so hard to keep farmed animals invisible to society. The
Right.
only time people might see them is when there's a livestock truck passing them on the motorway or something. But yeah, if there's more
Yeah.
people with farmed animals in their homes, then it's as if we're making them the citizens of society with us.
Yeah, and I really do believe that that's an extremely powerful, and as of yet not really appreciated, way to combat
Mm.
speciesism, is when you present farmed animals as living lives that would otherwise be associated only with, like a
Hmm.
cat. Because, not to say that like you want to have a cow living in your living room, but like with species like chickens, especially, like they can be very happy in like urban apartment
Mm.
settings. But I think more just generally, like depicting a life in which they're treated in the same ways that our society typically only associates with
Mm.
dogs or cats, it really forces us to rethink that speciesist narrative that farmed animals only belong out in the country on the
Mm.
farm, and the animals we live with are all dogs and cats, or
Hmm.
are all companions. And so that dividing line between food and companion is a very, very established one. And I do think that vegans inherit that, and a lot of times replicate that, when they continue to only talk about these animals in the context of them being
Mm.
raised and slaughtered
Hmm.
for food. And I don't want to diminish that advocacy, and I don't want to diminish the activism that doesn't directly involve animals as participants, because
Mm.
I believe that there are many forms of activism that need to be done, and not everybody has the ability to provide
Hmm.
care. And I don't want to, like, to vilify anybody for that. But I do just want to say that, like, for people who feel an interest and have the resources, there's a huge potential to, one, provide depth, but also add new dimensions and new strategies to your vegan
Mm.
activism, while also doing the amazing thing of providing a life of
Hmm.
respect and love to these individuals who otherwise are just seen as
Hmm. Okay.
byproducts.
So sanctuary is kind of like I guess, the ideal and the last stop on the journey from liberation. So it's like the flip side of sanctuary then is the act of liberating, or the process
Right.
of liberation. And obviously that comes with a lot of challenges in terms of security, risks to the sanctuaries,
Hmm.
risks to
Yeah.
the non-human animals during that process, and even when they're at the sanctuary. So recently, there's been, on social media at least, I mean, liberations have obviously always happened, but there's quite a drive from a lot of activists
Hmm.
encouraging other people to start, other activists to start liberating and saying, yeah, this is what we need to be doing. This is the kind of direct action we should be doing, a lot more of,
Right.
at least. So, have you got any thoughts then on like the balance, or the some of the complications, I guess, that come along with liberation? In yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I definitely have some thoughts on that. So let me first say that I'm in 100% in favor of
Mm,
animal liberation. I don't need to
mm,
qualify that in any way. I think if we can get them out, we should get them out. And it's not my place to say how to do it or where to do it. But I think just as in general, animal liberation is entirely a worthwhile form of
mhm,
activism to pursue. Um, Now, I do think that doing this comes with a lot of risks, especially with animals who are considered more valuable, like larger
mhm,
mammals. It really comes with a risk because not so much with birds, but with mammals, especially, like all farms are required to ID their animals. So some of those can be permanent, like
mhm.
tattoos. And so, like anytime that an animal is liberated, like, if a farm pursues it, the authorities are not going to be
Yeah.
on your side. And if they can find that animal and ID that animal, they will take that
Mm,
animal back. And so when I start to get concerned is when an animal liberation effort is presented primarily as like an outreach
mm,
effort and not as a liberation and a rescue
mhm,
effort. And when animals are put in positions of like their rescue and their place, when they get to a sanctuary, like it creates a large social media
mm,
push because the more public you are with a liberation, the more risk you're bringing with you to for the authorities and the farm to be alerted. And I've seen it happen where farms are able to find an animal who was liberated from their farm, and inevitably the animal is
mhm.
repossessed, for lack of a better word. And and so a lot of times, like, so I think like a lot of times rescues are tied to fundraising efforts, if they're very
Mhm.
public. Sometimes it's just tied to kind of like an educational desire on the part of the rescuers or the sanctuary. But I just would encourage anyone who does animal liberation to think very carefully about the
Mhm.
safety of the animal. Like, I'm all for providing education, but I don't know that it's worth it or even advisable to risk the safety of a liberated animal for the purpose of doing
Yeah.
education. And that goes back to what I said before about the movement often being about animals but not including
Mhm.
animals. And if you see a liberated animal as a participant in your activism and in your life, then why would you want to potentially risk them
Mm,
being taken back? There's nothing worse that could
mhm,
possibly happen than for them to be
mm,
repossessed by the farm. Um,
mm,
so I think just thinking in the bigger picture like that is something that I would highly encourage everyone who's interested in
mm.
liberation efforts to really consider the potential consequences of being public about individual animals, like
Mm,
once they're liberated.
mhm. Yeah, it's definitely, unfortunately, become a bit of a social media trend almost recently.
Hmm.
You know, open rescue. I guess sometimes the animals are liberated with the agreement of the farmer, so that's, I suppose that's
Hmm.
okay. But I suppose it could
Right.
go wrong if your goal is to, if you start liberating some animals during this open rescue and the authorities aren't going to, the farmer isn't going to let this happen, and the authorities are going to try and
Right.
track those animals down. So yeah, there's so much. It's kind of, I suppose, people are
Hmm.
kind of trying to justify it with the balance of saying, well, we need to show people that we're going to go in and we're going to liberate animals, and this is what they deserve, and that kind of thing. So But yeah, that's
Right.
yeah.
Well, but yeah, but I mean, they also deserve to be safe. Um, you know, so like I totally understand that, but I mean, you can if you just wanted to do education, you could do that
Yeah.
without taking an animal out. So like if the point is to liberate an animal, I think liberation means more than just getting them off of a farm. Like it also means
Hmm.
making sure that they're safe for the rest
Hmm.
of their lives. So that's why I would just like again encourage everyone to kind of really think through what is involved with doing liberation like that, and kind of recognize that putting them potentially at risk, I think
Hmm.
is very problematic, because once they're safe, like we want to
Yeah.
keep them safe.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay. And what kind of resources are available then through the Microsanctuary Resource Center to people who are interested, or what's maybe the most the one that's asked for the most, or
Yeah, so we're unique as an organization because we have probably the main resource that we have running right now is our micro grant program. So we're able to provide grants of anywhere from $500 to $1,000, and we're unique because we do grants to people who are not nonprofit organizations. So we provide micro grants to individuals who haven't registered as like a tax exempt
Mhm.
charity yet, and most places that do grants restrict it only to nonprofits. So we're unique in that we're able to provide help to people who haven't registered as a nonprofit. And part of that is because we don't necessarily think that becoming tax exempt is required to be a
Mhm.
micro sanctuary. As I said before, you can do a micro sanctuary with one hen, and I can't imagine that most places with people with one hen are going to want to register as a nonprofit and do tons of
Yeah.
fundraising and stuff like that. So, but we're able to help out with like special projects and with reproductive health care, which is a big push for us, especially for hens, to help with relieving them from the burden
Mhm.
of egg laying. And so, we have the micro grant program that's there to help out with special projects and with reproductive health care. And we also have other resources, like we run a number of like community discussion groups, like I mentioned,
Mhm.
Vegans with Chickens, and there are a few others on Facebook as well. We provide like direct mentorship to new and existing micro sanctuaries to just kind of help with caregiving questions and other logistical
Mhm.
questions that they have. And then beyond that, we also really try to have an ongoing relationship, just like with the sanctuary movement in general, and also
Mhm.
activists, to kind of help with educating more about the kind of need and the potential, like or just the potential like benefits of doing rescue and running a micro sanctuary. And we have other programs that we're developing as well, but we haven't come out yet, haven't come out with yet. But we really, like I said, our main area of growth that we want to focus on is increasing the interest in urban
Mhm.
micro sanctuaries amongst vegan activists, and also continuing to kind of help educate people about caregiving, and especially like working with vets to provide medical care.
Yeah, so there's a lot of support there then actually, sounds like it. So, yeah, I think, anyone looking at the website will see the benefits of there straight
Mhm.
away.
Yeah, and also too, like I do want to highlight, especially you can
Mhm.
find these on our website, is the core principles of Micro Sanctuary Resource Center. And this is something that we developed when we were starting the Micro Sanctuary movement, and it was done out of a desire to be intentional in like one, centering veganism in the concept of sanctuary, and specifically for us micro sanctuaries, just because as far as I'm concerned, like if you use and exploit animals, you're not
Mhm.
providing sanctuary. You're providing a home, but sanctuary is about freedom from exploitation. And if you're perpetuating exploitation, you're not actually providing
Mhm.
sanctuary, as far as I see it. But also beyond that, just thinking about the relationship between humans and non-humans at sanctuaries, and what it meant to free them from
Mhm.
exploitation. And so, we came up with a set of core principles. It was originally six, to kind of really flush out some essentials to keeping sanctuary ethical and liberatory for non-humans. We also added a couple years ago a core principle against
Mhm.
buying animals. And this is a fairly controversial topic, just because a lot of people do buy animals to free them from farms and other places, but we don't encourage that, just because we don't want to be one, like continuing to put animals in the position of being, for a price, and two, to be putting money back into the farming system that's just going to keep other animals being, exploited. And then the last one we added was on encouraging like a collective liberation approach, in the sense of like, participating in and supporting other social justice movements, and realizing that, the liberation effort for non-humans is inherently tied up with the liberation for all beings from any form of oppression.
Yeah, and I mean that's really, at the moment anyway, or maybe it's always been like this, and I'm quite new to the movement within the last 3 years, really, but there seems to be a real push to make it about animals only and to leave human issues out of
Right.
the picture, which
Yeah.
is kind of bizarre. But
Yeah.
to me, it's
Yeah,
it's
it's
like
ridiculous.
it's
Yeah.
definitely coming from a kind of right wing authoritarianism kind of standpoint.
Yeah, I don't understand it. I mean, it's ridiculous to me for a whole host of reasons, but I mean, even just on a
Mm.
purely personal level, like, the majority of the MRC board is queer in one way or another. Whether it's gender identity or sexual
Mhm.
identity, or skin color, things like that. Like, so for all of us, we personally understand that being vegan for the animals also comes with a whole lot of other stuff, just living one's life as a human in a patriarchal,
Mm.
capitalist society. And so, just on a purely like personal level, like all of us relate to our veganism in different ways based upon who we are and how we
Mm.
experience society. And so as caregivers, like, it's really easy to make connections between non-human animal oppression and
Mm.
human oppressions. And so, not to say that they're all equivalent, but to say that like these oppressions are all oftentimes like coexisting in our everyday lives, and and not only in like the non-human animals
Mhm.
whom we live with. But I mean, just on a purely like theoretical level, it seems ridiculous and contradictory to believe that anybody can be vegan only for the animals, and veganism is, a pure movement that is
Mhm.
only about animals. I mean, as long as there are ideologies and mentalities of oppression, it's going to replicate and continually drive down to someone below another person, where oppression is enacted. And so, if you think about veganism in terms of justice and liberation from oppression, then it makes sense that it's something that exists with other movements
Mm.
doing the same thing. And now I won't pretend that doesn't sometimes bring up, complications and tensions, but the way that you deal that is by interacting with and intersecting with other social justice movements. It doesn't come from saying, nope, veganism
Mhm.
is only animals. We're not going to talk to anybody else. You're not allowed to bring that in here. I think it's one, counterproductive, and two,
Yeah.
just contradictory for what veganism at its heart is. And so it's very frustrating for me. And I think that especially like when vegan activists who start perpetuating these like oppressive ideologies and saying like, well, your
Mm.
disability doesn't matter, or your skin color doesn't matter, or your gender identity doesn't matter, it keeps people from participating in
Mm.
the movement just on a purely practical level. I mean, if people aren't included and aren't respected for who they are, and their own unique individuality, like how the hell are we supposed to respect the individuality of
Mm.
non-human animals when we can't even do that to other humans? I think it's just, I mean, it's very frustrating to me. I think it's
Mm.
just lazy. I think there's no logic behind it. I think it's oftentimes done out of a desperation because, things are so bad with
Mm.
non-human animals. But you don't have to be basically just, a
Mm.
closed-minded jerk to other people when you're trying to be a
Mhm.
vegan activist. And, so much of about it is just like cultivating a sense of
Mm.
respect for other beings. And if we're trying to fight oppression, why would you want to replicate oppression by closing down and minimalizing the experiences of other individuals? I don't see how it
Mhm.
makes any sense. And it's extremely disrespectful. And I'm somebody who's a white male passing very easily, and even for me, like it makes zero sense, and I don't understand why people go out of their way to try to shut down and shut out individuals who are wanting to participate in the vegan movement, but are being told that they're not that they're
Yeah.
not valuable.
Was there anything you wanted to say, like in closing?
Yeah, I mean, I would just reiterate the kind of core ethic of the microsanctuary movement as a thing is that we really want to encourage people to find ways to connect with non-human animals and to see the value in having a relationship with them, even if it isn't in like a caregiving component. So the more that anyone is able to, volunteer at microsanctuaries and sanctuaries or to support them, to share the stories of the residents there, I think it does more to a lot to fight this notion that non-human animals are merely victims, and that we know them only as in their portrayal of being shipped off to slaughter. And I also would encourage everyone to kind of really think about how the act of caregiving and providing care and sanctuary to individuals who are seen by society as merely commodities, how that's a radical act, and how that does a lot to fight speciesist assumptions that we have about non-humans, and to change the narrative about them as we try to encourage people to rethink their lifestyles and to stop perpetuating the exploitation of non-humans.
Okay, thank you.